Well, good noon, as we say here in London, and I'm delighted to have as our guest today Andrew Burnett, CBE. Andrew is a dear colleague whom I met via Gresham College, and Andrew is here today to talk about what did the Romans ever have to teach us about money. Now, you've read his biography. He's a numismatist, museums and institutions professional, but one of his great subjects is Roman coinage. So never say that FS Club doesn't bring you the very latest in news from 753 BC, or as they say in Latin, ab urbe condita, from the founding of the city. Now, you'll know me, I'm Michael Mainelli, I'm one of the directors of Zien, and it is always a pleasure to be able to introduce these webinars because we range widely and freely across technology, economics, and finance. And today may seem a bit quirky to some of our sponsors that where are they going with this one? But actually, it is intriguing how many of the things in finance date back an extremely long time. Many of you will know that we brought out an eternal coin in long finance some 17 years ago as a bit of a thought piece, but we also brought out a Gresham coin a few years ago on publication of Gresham's Law by John Guy. And in the case of Gresham's Law, of course, although it's attributed to Thomas Gresham, who lived from 1519 to 1579, in reality, it goes back, and the oldest that we can date it in writing is to Aristophanes the Frogs, approximately the 8th century BC. So many of these things go around and come around again, and that might include things in today's discussion like Bitcoin. Now, just to remind you of the program, Andrew will be speaking for about 20 minutes. My job is to get out of the way as quickly as possible, but I will make 3 points if I may. Firstly, the slides are there and posted, and you can see them. Secondly, yes, this is being recorded, and the recording will be up in approximately 2 working days, i.e. sometime around midday on Friday, for you to share with friends, family, and colleagues over the weekend, of course. And then finally, the idea here is to have a discussion because I'm sure you'll have a lot of questions. I do. Please feed those questions into the chat room. Use the GoToWebinar facility. I'm here with you, not on email or Signal or WhatsApp. Feed them in. I'll feed them into the conversation with Andrew. If there's too many questions or a question of great detail, your email is attached. Andrew will be getting all of the emails from you if you wanted to contact him directly about something. Anyway, as I say, my job is to get out of the way, but before I do so, we just thought a small poll question for you might be of some fun. Now, I've given you a hint as to why 753 BC is up there. It is from the founding of Rome, but roughly, when did coinage first emerge in Rome? Was it 753 BC, the coin itself defined the city? Was it 510, 300, 107? Was it in 37, the time of Julius Caesar? We're collecting the responses now. As I warned you, Andrew, we have a very opinionated audience out there, and over half of them have answered. So I'll leave it open for just a few more seconds as we get ourselves up to the 3/4 mark. And I'll be closing the poll in just a moment and presenting the results. Well, Andrew, here they are. So the majority, well, not the majority, but 48%, almost the majority, if this is a Brexit vote, believe that it was 510 BC. So we're going to hand back to you. The floor is yours. But Andrew, what is the right answer?
Well, thanks a lot, Michael, and good afternoon to everybody. Well, the correct answer is actually about 300 BC, but I'm impressed many people chose 510, which of course was the end of the kingship period in Rome when they established democracy. So that would have been another interesting date. And indeed, 300 is an important date because it's when Rome really starts interacting with the rest of the Mediterranean world and starts conquering Italy, Spain, and ultimately the Eastern Mediterranean. And that's really why they adopted coinage at that time, because they then joined, as it were, the then international world of the Mediterranean. So today I'm going to talk about what did the Romans ever have to teach us about money, and the answer, I think, will be, well, I already do part of the answer today in the 20 minutes we've got, will be they have quite a lot to teach us about it, but of course, as ever, the lessons of history have often been forgotten. So although they've taught us much, I'm afraid to say people don't often remember what they might. So put the next slide, please. The talk I'm going to give is going to be in 4 parts. One about words used for money. Secondly, about the quantity theory of money. I do modern resonance with QE and inflation. Third, dealing with inflation, for now quite a hot topic, of course, for all of us. And fourthly, a glance at our particular local bit of the Roman Empire, Roman Britain, and what changed when the Romans came here in AD 43. So next, please. So we'll start with a few words. But the word money itself actually comes from the Latin moneta, which didn't mean money originally. It meant the Roman mint. It meant mint. And the Roman mint was situated, as you can see in the slide, in the center of Rome. And only later did the word come to mean the product of the mint, i.e. money itself. The Roman mint was in the Temple of Juno Moneta, Juno of Moneta, which for those of you who know Rome, you can see in the picture on the left, that white building, the monument of Victor Emmanuel. It's just in front of the right-hand end. And if you look at the plan, you can sort of see it towards the top, marked on the plan. The other important building to note is number 9, the Temple of Saturn, which again you can just see on the picture, the bottom right, that little row of columns, and that was where the Roman treasury was located. So the mint was located near to the treasury. So the mint, the word money comes from moneta, which comes from the mint, which was on the Capitoline hill, Temple of Juno Moneta. Next, please. Next. So why was it in the Temple of Juno Moneta? Well, we can see it being celebrated here on this coin, made time Julius Caesar, where we've got the head on the left, labelled, for those of you who can read coins, Moneta, head of Juno Moneta, the goddess, next to whose temple the mint was located, and we can wonder why Juno Moneta was the patroness of coinage. What does moneta mean originally? Well, of course, I'm glad to say there's a good scholarly dispute on the matter. The word perhaps means warning, and indeed it's supposed that some geese warned the Romans that a Gallic attack was about to take place in 390 BC, which is why the temple acquired that name. And other theories link it to the Greek goddess of memory, or words like memorialize. Next. Another word, LSD. You probably all know this, which of course fell out of date really with decimalizations 50 years ago. LSD, pounds, shillings, pence. L for libra, S for solidi, D for denarii. Names of Roman coin names which persisted after the Roman Empire into the Middle Ages and then till the modern period. Next, please. Now let's look a bit at the Romans' money, Romans' money itself. So here's a slide showing the range of coins that were produced, as it happens in this case under the Emperor Nero, a gold coin, a silver coin, and a range of base metal coins made of brass, copper, or bronze. You can see below. Next, please. So what were they all worth? Well, you can see the gold coin had quite a high value, although it's notoriously difficult to give modern equivalences to ancient values, because things cost different amounts. Manufacturing goods, for example, manufactured goods were relatively much more expensive because it was all made by hand and then machines and so on and so forth. But you can see there's a range of values from about 1,000 on this slide down to about £2, and indeed there are smaller ones as well, down to about 50 pence in modern money. So a good range of coinage that could be used for a wide range of activities and transactions. So I want to talk here to the next slide about one of the interesting theories, which again has modern resonance, the so-called quantity theory of money, which, as I say, resonates today with quantitative easing. So we recognize a law called Boudin's law, named after Jean Boudin, who was a humanist in France in the 16th century, who was very struck by the rise in prices, which was attributed at the time to the rise in the amount of coinage available in Europe, which of course was fueled in turn by the discoveries of precious metal in the Americas, exploited particularly by the Spanish. Now, Jean Boudin wrote about this, and it's very interesting. If you actually read his book, which of course nobody does now, printed in originally 1568, sorry for the typo on the slide, you can find that although he'd noted the problem, it was to the classical sources of Roman history that he turned to try and explain it. And indeed, he found various citations in ancient literature, which I put two on the screen. One, a letter from the Roman orator Cicero. When there was a shortage of coin, the value of properties has gone down. Less money, prices are lower. And the converse, in Suetonius's Life of Augustus, when the Emperor Augustus eventually conquered Mark Antony and Cleopatra and captured Egypt, Egypt was fabulously wealthy. They brought all the wealth of Egypt back to Rome, and as Suetonius says, he made money so plentiful, the rate of interest fell, and the price of land rose greatly. So there's clearly an awareness in these ancient authors of the relationship between the amount of money and the level of prices. Although it all began, then of course it was discovered first of all by Jean Boudin, then by, as you know, discussed by many modern economists, and I'm sure you will know that much better than me, Irving Fisher being a notable one amongst them. Next, please. So related to the increase of prices, the increase of money, is of course inflation. And again, you'll be not surprised to discover there's an animated scholarly discussion about what happened with inflation in the Roman world. And you can see a few views which have been expressed, summarized on this slide. There does generally seem to have been a gradual increase in prices over the first 300 years of the Roman Empire, which reflects a change in the use of the coins from some of the smallest ones as the most common one used and indeed lost and found today, and slightly bigger ones. But a more particular interest is, which we'll come back to in a second, is mentioned at the bottom, the huge leap in price levels from around about AD 270. Next, please. Now, of course, everything about studying inflation in the past is very contentious. How do you actually measure inflation? People typically have used the price of wheat, bottom right, but of course that is very subject to all sorts of fluctuations, weather, supply, warfare, as indeed we know currently. Its value is that we have prices for wheat much more frequently than any other object. But if you look at other objects such as donkeys and wheat and so on, summarized in this slide, you can see the pattern is slightly different. Nevertheless, there is a general trend upwards, which seems quite clear. And then, as I say, although it's not shown on the slide, from about 300, there's a very steep incline. Next, please. And this is generally attributed to the decline in the silver content of the coinage, which is shown on this graph, from 100% in AD 1 to about nothing by AD 300, and a particularly steep decline, as you can see, coinciding in about 260, 270 AD, just about the time of the then rampant inflation that began in the Roman Empire. So there does seem to be a link between the debasement of coinage and hence presumably the production of more and more coins, an increase in money, and the increase in prices at the time. Next, please. What happened then is a complete change in the Roman monetary system, that the coins stopped having a fixed relationship to each other as they had before. You know, £1 is 100 pence, $1 is 100 cents, and so on and so forth. In the early Roman period, one denarius was worth 4 sestertii and 16 asses. But this system stopped in about 300, and the price of the value of the gold coin started to float upwards against the bronze coinage. And you can see on the right the extraordinary increase in value caused by this, where the gold coin worth about 1,000 denarii in AD 300, in less than 100 years became something like 400 times less valuable, an enormous compound rate of inflation. With this, of course, is money inflation, not price inflation. So it was a real problem then, and the Roman emperors were very aware of it, and they thought they should try and do something about it. So what did they try and do? Next, please. Well, the Roman emperor, to one example, Diocletian, famously tried to address the problem. Next, please. And he did it by publishing an enormous set of inscriptions all around the empire, giving the maximum price permitted for all sorts of things. And you can see an example here of various horses and what the maximum price allowed for them was. This is an example of the surviving inscription. Next, please. And covered a whole range of things, as you can see. Something like over 1,000 items were specified. And if we look at what he thought he was doing, next please, you can see on the preamble from his edict, the very sort of emotional language he used about how important it was to get rid of this terrible evil of inflation, which was wrecking society. And I think it's no accident that the language used by Diocletian very much is echoed by the language used in the debates 50 years ago in the 1970s, when the Heath government introduced price and wage, notoriously introduced price and wage control. Lord Jellicoe, the Lord Privy Seal, as you can see in the House of Lords, is talking about how not only the economy will be crippled, but democracy will also be eroded. Well, surprise, surprise, Diocletian's attempt to control prices and the Heath governments both failed. Next, please. And again, the parallels between the two are quite similar. One of Diocletian's great critics, Lactantius, who hated Diocletian because he was one of the last Roman emperors to persecute the Christians. As he's a very negative view of everything, but as he says, although he induced this law, in the end, having proved destructive, it was merely annulled. And again, it's quite amusing to see the echoes of this in the debates in the 1970 in the British Parliament, and indeed Lord Robbins, one of the opposition peers, cites the futility of Diocletian's example himself. Next, please. So just briefly towards the end, just say a few words about what the Romans did for Britain when they invaded it. They invaded in AD 43, after campaign. The Emperor Claudius, shown on the right, set up a triumphal arch, which doesn't survive, but parts of its inscription do. And as soon as the Romans came in, they introduced a very developed and sophisticated financial and legal system, which hadn't existed before in Britain, but existed in other parts of the empire. And we can see it in a number of ways. Next. For example, the recent discoveries at the Bloomberg site, which I hope people have been to visit, the Bloomberg site with its wonderful Mithraeum, these brilliant reading by experts of some of these wooden tablets, which originally were coated with wax, and you can just about read the letters which have been inscribed through on the wood and have been deciphered. Some of the earliest ones, next please, are financial documents, and here's one, AD 57, only about 10 years after the invasion of Britain, and already we can see quite a developed monetary system is in use. And we know that from the archaeological evidence too, next please, that a whole range of small monetary transactions could now take place, because some of the very smallest coins worth very little, roughly 50p, have been found extensively in Britain. And here's an example from Oxfordshire. And if we look at the next slide, we can see, thanks to this wonderful system, the Portal Antiquities scheme, which was introduced about 10, 15 years ago, such finds are made all over the country. So we can see that as soon as the Romans arrive, they introduce a sophisticated and complicated system of monetary transactions, replacing much more primitive, we assume, systems that existed before. But of course, the new source system brought its own dangers. Next, please. And one of those dangers was forgery. And sticking to the vicinity of Bank, this very interesting hoard was found in St. Swithin's Lanes, but some 200 years ago. And both these coins, as you can see, depict the Emperor Claudius and his triumphal arch for conquering the Britons. But the one at the bottom is not part of the hoard, but you can see it's a solid silver coin. The one at the top, as you can see, it's got a silver plating over a copper coin, where you can see it's the silver plating is coming off on the head of the emperor, and indeed off parts of the triumphal arch on the back. And this hoard had at least 89, probably about 100 similar fake coins in it. And down to the latest date of AD 51. So it shows that no sooner had the Romans suddenly introduced their financial system that people started faking coins, and so fraud was never far away. So next, please. So what did the Romans ever have to teach about us? Well, as I say, I think quite a lot, even though they didn't. People haven't listened much today to what they had to say about it, but I'm very grateful to you all for listening to what I've said this morning. Thank you.
Andrew, that was superb. Thank you so much. And also, you kept brilliantly to time, which allows us a lot of time for questions. We've got quite a few people online, so please do type your questions in quickly, or comments or observations, so that I can feed them in. I was also pleased that you made a pitch for the Mithraeum. Both St. Swithin's Lane is actually just behind me, right there. That window is St. Swithin's Lane, and the Mithraeum is about another 100 yards further on. It's a wonderful exhibition under the Bloomberg building, and you can book it free online and go and see some of this. Andrew, just to kick off quickly, that very precipitous slide on silver was particularly interesting to me. It went nearly to zero in 300 AD, yeah. But what was in the coin? Was it copper, or how did they manage to handle that?
Yeah, they initially made out of more or less pure silver. I mean, Roman silver was actually originally finer than British. Sterling silver is not pure silver; it's only 92% fine. Whereas the Romans began with 100, and it gradually declined until, by adding, as you say, increasing amounts of copper and indeed the much cheaper metal, lead, until by the end of the 3rd century, as we saw, there's almost no silver in it. They did have this technique, though, of sort of what we call silver washing them. They produce a base metal coin, and then they'd increase the silver on the surface, so it looked much more silver than it actually was.
Yeah, it's an intriguing bit, the debasement of coinage, which happens everywhere. Again, Aristophanes talks about it, because that is the opposite of Gresham's law. Good money drives out bad unless they're forced to exchange. Bad money drives out good unless they're forced to exchange for the same price. Now, lots of questions here. Let's get cracking. Hugh Purser is curious: was early coinage very limited to a small strata of society, and if so, how small?
Well, it depends what you mean by early coinage. I mean, the very earliest coins in the West, which were made in what's now modern Turkey, Western Asia Minor, in about 700 BC, were made of a curious alloy of gold and silver called electrum. We don't know exactly how widely they were used, but clearly it's got some sort of precious metal element. suggesting that it would only be used for slightly higher transactions, and in that sense, probably not widely used. Although again, modern archaeological techniques have in recent years discovered more, as it were, small coins. Some of these coins are very tiny, suggesting that maybe they did have a slightly greater impact in the monetary world at the time than expected. But we don't really know. And of course, we forget that the ancient world was predicated on slavery. At least 40% of the population were slaves, and they likely had nothing to do with money. So it would only be in the sort of the wealthier classes, I think.
It's interesting as well how ubiquitous it was, because I remember going to purchase a Roman coin just off of the Strand, and I was surprised at how cheap it was. It wasn't really there were quite a few of them.
In my youth, I mean, I've never collected, but you could collect coins for less than a pound in the old days, and even nowadays, if anybody has any grandchildren or children they want to get going, you can buy a perfectly decent coin for less than £10 nowadays. I mean, really, because so many have been found. Yeah.
Dabe Carroll is curious. How did the Romans vary the amount of currency they created? And was it mainly or solely linked to the availability of silver? And Paul Taffender has a related question, I think. He thanks you for a great presentation. But you mentioned quantitative easing. How did the Romans print money other than capturing treasures in war?
Well, like many things I've said, I mean, there's a certain amount of dispute about all these things. Some of the coinage was made from freshly mined metal, and indeed the great supplies of silver in the ancient world seem to have been in Spain, the Rio Tinto mines. Other amounts were, as one of your questioners implied, gathered from the spoils of war. You defeat, people in the Eastern Mediterranean, and you capture their wealth, like Augustus did with the wealth of Egypt. And indeed, there is a gradual trend of wealth away from what was previously the eastern lands of the Mediterranean towards the centre, because that's where the centre of power is, and that's where the money comes from. So sources such as booty and fresh metal were very important, but also recycling the money. I mean, the particular focus of the Roman minting was indeed on the army, and you had to have enough coinage around to pay the army if you were the emperor, or else you'd be in trouble, considerably trouble. So the system was devised, especially in the late empire, whereby the government tried to recover as much gold as possible, and indeed use the gold to pay the soldiers. So you had to pay your taxes in gold, for example, and that was the main way that the Romans got hold of the gold to remint into new gold coins to pay the army to keep them loyal. I think I've covered most of the topics. I think.
Yeah. So there are a couple that trip off from that as well. So Donald McCrae is curious: did the Romans actively control the quantity of coin and money? But did they understand it? And then Nikki Holthouse is curious: what advice would you have given the ancient Romans to manage their inflation issues? So sort of a double-edged thing there.
Well, I mean, again, it is disputed to what extent the Romans actively tried to control the amount of money, or to what extent they were just aware of the consequences. I think we have good evidence that when there was a shortage of coinage, they were aware of that, and as we've seen from one or two of the sources I mentioned, and they did increase the amount. And for example, the shortage of coinage that took place when Caesar was mostly in control of Rome in the 40s BC, we know from letters such as the one I quoted about the shortage of coinage. And it's precisely at that time when the Romans start, where they introduce a very large scale gold coinage. And it looks very much like this is introduced to try and ameliorate the problems of the shortage of cash. whether they tried to moderate too, well, because one of the problems of their system, as indeed with many modern systems, when you're running a bimetallic system, what happens when the relative value of gold and silver changes? Now, and of course that was the thing that exercised modern governments hugely from the early modern period onward. But it's less of a problem for the Romans because they're just dealing with one big area rather than lots of different states. And of course, there was an international trade, and it looks like they probably, as it were, made the gold coinage the principal coin, and they weren't quite so worried about whether the silver coin had, as it were, equivalent amounts of silver in it, but rather less, so they didn't have to regulate that quite so much.
John Sunderland, I think related to this as well, was there any exchange of foreign coinage used in the Roman Empire? Were there other currencies in circulation?
No, they obviously weren't allowed in. I mean, the areas round the Roman Empire, especially to the east, the Parthian and later Sasanian empires, the Persian empires, had coinages of their own, but they're never found inside the Roman Empire.
So it's not like our Spanish pieces of 8 situation.
No. And we do know that the Romans had quite rigorous import controls. For example, if you were importing something like, I don't know, luxuries from India, silk or gems, you had to pay a whopping 25% tariff when you entered the Roman Empire. So clearly they're very good at controlling their borders and hence kept foreign coinage out. And indeed the tax system pervaded the whole empire. I mean, you had to pay another tax when you took goods from one province to another, not at the same level, but much lower level. So the whole thing was quite regulated, but of course that had the same effect, that it tended to be a bit more fragmented as a result, that things didn't travel as much as they would in the modern world.
Okay. Stephen Murgatroyd has a somewhat snide comment. It's been mentioned that the euro should not have been introduced until the united government is in existence, as with the Romans. But leaving the politics to one side, what were some of the effects on accounting and numbers? So we have here James Fleck. Did the Roman numeral system hinder financial transactions and understanding of inflation, etc.? And Byron Gilliam is interested in how long did Roman coins remain used as a unit of account?
Well, there's a lot of questions there. I mean, one of the puzzling things is about Roman numerals, which, I mean, I don't know how many of people attending tried to learn Roman numerals when they were at school or whatever. They had the most clunky system imaginable, didn't they? But it's quite because I mean, only half the Roman Empire, the western bit, spoke Latin and used Roman numerals. The other half, the eastern half, sort of from Adriatic east, spoke Greek, and they used Greek numbers, which actually were very similar to our Arabic system, just two digits. But I think there's no suggestion that they found the counting arithmetical system so clunky that it impeded their counting. I think it was just the way they wrote it down was very complicated. I've forgotten what the other questions were now.
It was how long were the Roman coins? How long was it used as the unit of account as opposed to maybe in circulation?
Well, I mean, the Roman denarius, for example, lasted from about 200 BC until about AD 450. That's 650 years. And then there were the late Roman gold coin, the solidus, which was introduced in 300, went on in some form or other for about the same long period, 500. But the coins gradually became more and more debased, more and more silver, which is why the word solidus ended up actually meaning shilling, like the silver coin in LSD where we started. But as I say, the words are still with us.
John Sunderland again, just a quick one. Did Romans clip coins?
They did. and there are quite severe penalties for it, which we know in some of the Roman law codes, Roman law codes. To our way of thinking, the Roman legal system is rather strange because the penalty depended on your social status. So if you clipped coins and you were a slave, that was it. You'd had it. If you were a senator, you might be banished. So that was that seems a bit socially unjust, even if just. But one of the interesting clipping is very interesting because it occurs a lot actually in Britain at the end of the Roman period. Lots of coins were clipped around the edges, so often you lose the legend, you only see the emperor's head. And this does seem to be related to the end of Roman Britain and the departure of the Roman authorities and army, and heralds the breakdown, in fact, of the monetary system that they introduced 400 years ago.
It's intriguing here when we're thinking about the future. Nevertheless, you pulled us up on the 3rd century. Our famous scholar Robin Derbyshire is online, and he's saying the 3rd century was where there was some severe devaluation, but it was a period of great disruption in the empire, sometimes referred to as the crisis of the 3rd century. Do you have a view as to whether this crisis led to the devaluation, or perhaps vice versa?
Well, it's again like everything in academic fields, it's hotly disputed to what extent there was a crisis in the 3rd century. But we can see that there were obviously military and political crises. Roman emperors never lasted more than a few years. There was quick turnover, and indeed one can see that in various ways that the economy of the Roman Empire became more and more fragmented, more and more regionally based than had been the case. I think the monetary system has played a part in that because I think it caused real problems for the Roman Empire to supply the coinage to all the parts of the empire that was needed, exacerbating the problems. But I mean, I wouldn't say one caused the other so much. I think there's an interdependence, as you know, as the monetary problems begin, so the economic problems begin, and they feed off each other. Indeed, creating. I'm sure it was in monetary terms. There's no doubt it was a crisis of the period. You can just see that from the thing you mentioned earlier, Michael, the graph of the decline of silver.
Anthony Abel is curious. He says he has a colleague who claims it was faster to bank across the Mediterranean with the Middle East and North Africa in the Roman era than it is now by modern banks and telecoms. Any thoughts on that? What was sort of the speed of transaction?
Yeah, well, that's nonsense, actually. I mean, it is true that the Romans could do paper transactions. It's often forgotten, and people think it was only in hard coin. But of course, the evidence for that is quite limited. But we do have, although we don't have direct evidence for the speed of financial transactions, we do know how long it took news to get around the Roman Empire. And the sort of classic way of measuring it is, when did news of a new Roman emperor get to particular provinces? And the particular province which we got the most information about is Egypt, where all those papyri have been preserved in the dry climate of Egypt. And it shows that, well, it depended on the time of year, but it could take up to 2 to 3 weeks the knowledge of a new emperor to reach Egypt, which is quite striking, because I mean, if you did something in the name of the wrong emperor, it might cause you real trouble. So it was very important you get that news as quickly as possible. So I can't believe any financial transaction would have taken place any faster than that.
No. Paul Taffender, I mean, there's a lot of work going on with David Graeber, for example's book Debt, the First 5,000 Years, where there's been a lot of puncturing of the myth that Adam Smith perpetrated, that, you know, we had barter and then we had coinage. Today, we're looking at a situation where the World Trade Organization estimates 25 to 40% of economic transactions are non-monetary, but that's a problem. I mean, it's, you know, if I babysit your kids for free, is that because we were trying to avoid a monetary transaction? So it's a tough one. But Paul Taffender's curious, did barter run alongside coinage for much of the empire? And if so, any idea how significant it was?
Well, again, we don't really know. I mean, we do hear occasionally of I wouldn't say so much barter as use of other high value materials such as gold, perhaps occasionally being used as a form of payment. But I mean, it is striking that there is evidence from the most rural settlements of Roman Britain, for example, of quite a extensive use of coinage in the late period. And you'd expect rural small holdings to be the one place, if any, where barter would be most likely to occur. But even there, we seem to have got evidence of coin use. So I think it was pretty quite limited. But I mean, I think the pattern of coin use introduced by the Romans, as I was saying, in Britain, is probably not so dissimilar from what we were familiar with until very recently.
Donald McCrae, any comments on how the Romans executed really large value transactions?
Well, I mean, partly in cash. There's the largest ancient gold coin hoard that is known was from northern Italy, consisted of 80,000 coins. So that would be, if one gold coin is roughly equivalent to £1,000, that's an £80 million transaction. It's probably thought that was actually Caesar's war chest that was lost at one point. And that's, I think 80 million is quite a big sum by ancient
Yeah,
standards, might be my modern standards.
I think that
Um,
quite. Now, I wore a joke tie today just in honor of money, but we have a really good question from Jonathan Brill. We have Monopoly. Did the Romans learn about money at all through games?
we don't know. I mean, we know they enjoyed gambling, but there's no surviving. Um, what would it be? Monopolium has not survived from antiquity. Sadly, that would have been very interesting if it had.
Now, I have two favorite quotes, in Latin about money. Pecuniam non olet, which was Vespasian trying to teach his son about don't be ashamed of the urine tax.
Ah, yeah.
But the other one is from Cicero, who you quoted earlier. So pecunia nervus belli, basically that money is the soul of war. Now, there's a great book that Roger Knight brought out almost 10 years ago on Britain against Napoleon, the organization of victory from, I think it was 1793 to 1815. And in that book, he explores the importance of the monetary system in funding the Napoleonic Wars.
Yeah.
Was there a comparable integrated look at that from the Romans, or was it just the money system was almost an externality they had to deal with?
No, I think it was what I mean from the governmental point of view. Funding the army, as I said, was probably the most important aspect of what they did, and it has been quite common until recently amongst scholars to argue that most issues were intended for military purposes, but I think that's probably a bit of an exaggeration. But but certainly, if you couldn't afford your wars either internal against other usurpers or external people against the Persians, you were in trouble, and you had to. So it was as important then as it is in the more recent period.
Well, as ever with compelling presentations, we're running up against time, but let me try two quick ones if I might. The first one is what do you think about the future of coin collecting
Ah,
as a numismatist, given the increasingly cashless society? That's from Dan Feeney.
well, I mean, I hope that coin collecting does have a future because, I mean, as we touched on earlier, you can form a perfectly decent collection for a very small outlay, and it's a wonderful way of bringing history to life for people. I mean, I used to work in the British Museum. I'm retired now. And I remember much agonising with the trustees and so on. We eventually introduced handling sessions in the gallery where people could actually handle real ancient coins, and they could hardly believe they were handling real coins, and it just brought the whole thing to life. In fact, I mean, I think probably the erosion of collecting, if that's the word, hasn't been particularly affected, so as far as we know yet, by the rise of bank cards. It was more has been more affected by, I'm afraid, the rise of computer games and so on and that sort of thing. People, and I'm sure you're aware of yourself, and many of your listeners as well, tend not to collect things in the way that they did. But certainly it can be, and I don't know what the price made. There was a gold coin of Brutus, the assassin of Caesar, on sale last week. I haven't looked up the price, but it was supposed to go for 4.5 million. So you can, if you're lucky and find something, you can do well out of it as well.
Who needs to gamble on Bitcoin when you can gamble on something you can hold in your hand?
That's right.
Very quickly then, final question for you. What's your favorite quote about money from the Latin period?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't think I really have one. I mean, my problems. I'm interested in all the different aspects, the way that it permeated ancient ancient society, and how it could be used as a sign of sort of moral decline as well. And I think I can't really answer the question. I'm sorry. I've just really thought. I'll give that one notice.
Oh, I mean, you would agree that there's still a lot of active research going on. This is not a closed question.
Huge amount, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I've alluded to some of the scholarly controversies, and they're not going to go away. But of course, I mean, every year coins are found. I don't know if any of the listeners have been lucky enough to find any themselves. You know, people with metal detectors go out and find things. So it's you know, there's always new things being discovered, and as a result, like all the best subjects, it's constantly changing. Partly because new material is found, but partly, of course, because the questions people ask change from generation to generation. There's interest in as indeed embodied in some of the questions we had today, in the social impact of coinage in the way that people wouldn't have been interested in it 2 generations ago.
Yeah, good. Well, sadly, we do have to bring it to a close. So if I could conclude with 3 quick remarks. Firstly, thanks to our sponsors. We really appreciate it that you do allow us to range so widely and freely. Your tolerance is much appreciated. Secondly, to you, the audience, you've been particularly vibrant today. We didn't quite get to all the questions, but as I said, Andrew will be sent them all. I think what I really picked up today was Byron Gilliam has a comment here about, you know, we're looking here at the Milton Friedman, it's all a monetary problem or it's all a fiscal phenomenon. And this goes back and forth, and history teaches us we're still unsure which rules. So I think that's been important. But thank you all very much for your contributions. Again, as ever, please just look at the website. But we do, in fact, tomorrow have a very fascinating, slightly historical one as well, where we're going to be looking at Paternoster Square here in London. A little bit local for us, but nevertheless, we thought we'd try 2 local ones in a week. And very finally, of course, Andrew, our very sincere thanks to you. You've been wonderful to come on board to share your erudition. I'm conscious that we often say to people, we're looking forward to having you back because they're in some fast-moving area. But we would look forward to having you back, but maybe not in a month or 2, maybe in a few years, and you can share some of the research that's ongoing, which is really important in terms of informing all of us on still Boudin's law, Gresham's law, inflation, quantitative easing, etc. We're still learning, and we appreciate you here teaching us. Thank you.
Okay, been a pleasure. Gresham will be a fine topic for the future.